So Aaron, thanks for being with us today.
Sure.
And I just wanted to welcome you to the land of Fabric of Life and the work that we're doing here. As the musician in residence, you know, the Becky and Lenny through their Bassett Homestead property are sort of hosting you for Fabric of Life. I'd love to hear just a little bit about like how you came to be a musician, you know, what it was like for you growing up, what, you know, what was interesting to you about it, anything you want to share in that.
Sure. So I actually know Becky through the like Balkan music and dance world. You know, she's a folk dancer and has hosted these parties, and so she has been very connected to this community that I grew up in, which is the community of people in the States playing music from Eastern Europe. And that's one of the communities I grew up in. I also grew up in kind of a Jewish music and klezmer scene as well. But yeah, so I grew up, my dad's a drummer. I grew up watching brass bands, kind of in the middle of them, with the people dancing around them. So I think for me, like music and community have always been very intertwined. And yeah, as I got older, I started writing my own music. I started learning horns. I'm mostly a horn player now. I'm surrounded by I have like 4 different horns around me right now. And yeah, I write music, I sing, I produce, I create original pop music. I also play in brass bands, both Balkan, Romani, Balkan style, and also like New Orleans second line style. And I think I'm kind of constantly trying to find the bridges between traditions and figure out how to express myself within different idioms. And I think regardless of what style I'm playing in, the kind of intention and the lessons from the other styles kind of infuse it all. You know, when I'm writing pop music, I think I draw a lot from my background in Balkan music and Turkish descended music, and Jewish music of different kinds. So yeah, I grew up in that community. I grew up in the Bronx in New York City in Riverdale, and have been playing music, you know, as early as I can remember. Started playing drums, became a horn player, learned guitar and piano, and I went to Oberlin College in Ohio. Not technically for music, not like I wasn't in the conservatory, but I was an American Studies major, and I was studying like music as communal social change. So I was doing a lot of, basically I got to use all the conservatory resources without actually being in the conservatory. I took a lot of lessons, I was in ensembles, and then I was doing like oral history projects with various people, with DJs, with this one Holocaust survivor, with mostly members of the Jewish and the Puerto Rican communities in the neighboring towns around Oberlin, kind of looking at how music is connected to transmission of identity. And so for me, it's really cool, the work that Fabric of Life is kind of bolstering, which is, you know, the transmission and the interpretation of collective folk traditions, and also like how to reinterpret them and, you know, express yourself within those. So I see a lot of parallels in the work that, though the medium is different. But yeah.
What was it that sort of drew you to work with the Jewish communities in terms of identity around music? Like, what was the foundation for that?
Well,
Puerto Rican communities.
Yeah, kind of twofold. I'm Jewish. I'm Ashkenazi Jewish. I grew up pretty relatively secular, Reconstructionist, which is like a denomination that's largely about individual interpretation and kind of a lot of the essence and asking questions without a lot of the kind of hierarchical infrastructure of a lot of the, you know, clergy stuff. So I grew up relatively secular, but I think the biggest in for me with it was the music. My dad like often drums for chanting, and also like organizes a band for the high holidays that I've always played in, mostly on trombone, but I've also play guitar, and then I blow the shofar, which is the ram's horn. It's kind of like the basis of my whole thing with these horns is blowing the shofar. So that's my like ancestral lineage, my own ethnic tradition, and something that I grew up very deep in, and also didn't necessarily consider to be mine until I got older and was able to create my own relationship with it. So I think that was part of it, and also recognizing, like, to be honest, recognizing that these are like the last years that there are going to be people who are Holocaust survivors alive and able to, sit down and have conversations. My grandma is a survivor, and her family was killed. And so I think what drew me to that was like thinking about memory as like a time sensitive resource, and wanting to connect with this one individual named Erwin who is in the area. As far as the Puerto Rican community, I grew up, when I was in high school, I joined like a youth Afro-Latin jazz orchestra. And so I started playing a lot of Cuban music, a lot of salsa, a lot of Puerto Rican music. Got pretty, and I think it's worth saying that while it's maybe not always recognized, I think a lot of the history of New York and a lot of the culture of New York and of the Bronx is distinctly Puerto Rican, and also, and like Caribbean and Latino. And I think like, I don't know, I also think there's like a rich history of Jews and Puerto Ricans, especially in the Bronx, and a complicated history. And so I was curious. There's a city called Lorain in Ohio that's about 10 miles north of Oberlin that used to be a very prosperous steel producing city, and actually was one of these towns that had a pact with the Puerto Rican governor in the 40s, where they brought an airplane full of like men from Puerto Rico to work in the factories. And so because of that, there's like this large Puerto Rican population, as well as East European population, Polish and Czech. And so, but then the steel mills have closed. And so, and this was also around like maybe a year after Hurricane Maria, and I had been doing some ESL language work in Lorraine. And so I was just very interested how memory has functioned for these two very different diasporic groups that were existing in the same place. And initially the project, I had wanted to also work with like many more people. I had wanted to work with, people who are Czech, people who are African American. Like I had wanted to really open it up, but I think it ended up just kind of focusing on these two populations. And it was interesting. I think there's things I definitely would have done different. But I think it also just stems from participating in the musical traditions, and a kind of humility and gratitude that comes from that. And basically what I did is I had people like sing songs that were like they believed were integral to their identity. So I just had two people from each group. And it was cool. It's funny, I don't talk about this project very much. It's like not something that is super like present, that I think about a lot. But yeah, it was important for me, and thinking about how song is so deeply connected to who we are, in ways that we can't predict. Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. I focus a lot. I mean, I write pop music, right? Like I write a lot. I focus on a lot of the more contemporary popular musics, but it was cool to kind of check in with older folks and hear some of the songs that they remember from their youth or whatever. So yeah, that was a part of that.
That's cool. Do you see, like I hear you say that you didn't necessarily think so much about that project anymore, but do you think that there is now some sort of a parallel or something that you've drawn forward that helps to support like your current way of songwriting and thinking about music?
Just in the context of thinking about how music can be both personal and collective. and really how any art can be deeply personal, but if it has emotional resonance, it will be collective. Yeah, I don't know. And I mean, maybe just in terms of like, just music as something that is intangible, and in that there's an enormous power in terms of like, you can't really take it away. And in my own practice, kind of music as an act of self-liberation, you know, as a queer person, as someone who's maybe not taking any of the practices of this collective culture at face value, and is maybe able, you know, happy to take a step back and kind of be like, well, how do I actually want to embody this? I think that's a lesson to take, just that music can be, you know, creating as an act of freeing yourself, regardless of what you're making, and regardless of if you show it to other people. But yeah, I mean, and as far as being here, I mean, this is just an incredible blessing and privilege to be here right now, and like such a joy. And to have space to create is not something I will ever take for granted. You know, I grew up very fortunate in many ways, but I grew up in an apartment and have neighbors that I have some tension with, especially around sound. And it got to a point where it's like I knew I couldn't be there anymore, and I knew I needed a place I could make music. And being able to be here and like just take my horn out and walk out into this field and play and just feel like the freedom in that is an incredible, incredible gift. Or just go take a walk and write and walk around these woods and come back here and record what I've been writing is like, it's an incredible thing. And I'm also someone who is pretty inspired by patterns like this, and by like alignment and symmetry and things like that. And so it's cool to be surrounded by so much care and so much intention that's been put into all these little things. I mean, this cabin is super cute, to be honest. It's just adorable. Like it hasn't been like the simplest living situation, and like I knew that would be the case. That's part of why I was like, I'm happy to, first off, in the COVID era, being isolated sounds great. And it's been challenging too. I've definitely reached points where I was like, oh, why do I feel so crazy? Oh, I haven't seen other people for like 3 days. And then I like hung out with Becky and Lenny, or hung out with my cousin who lives in Northampton now, and I was like, okay, I'm all right. Like, and the isolation is definitely, everything's a balance, but you know, I'm happy to also learn some real skills of like how to chop wood, how to like care for myself in a way that like I never even, when you grow up in a city, you don't even, I mean, it sounds so basic, but like you don't even realize all of the labor and all of the resources that go into sustaining the way that everyone lives constantly. All of the water, all of the heating oil, everything, all the food, like it's pretty unfathomable if you take a step back. And I've lived in semi-rural environments before, but mostly have lived in New York City, and so I'm like happy to be here and be able to reflect on that, and also like just not take for granted, and have some time to organize my next steps. Like, I have been flying by the seat of my pants for a long time, and it took me a long time to regroup after the pandemic hit, just because it had dissolved most of what I did for my life. And so then I got very invested in recording, which I was already doing, but like really working on this work, which is cool, but it's nice to just have some time to like breathe.
I mean, so much of the intention behind the work at Fabric of Life is, you know, to give people the opportunity to learn something, right? Or to like refine their craft, but also, you know, to have that space to be more introspective and more intentional and find more connection, you know, whether it's with people around them, or in your case, not as many people around you, you know, or just sort of the natural world around you.
Yeah.
You had said before we started that you already feel like you've gone through a few different iterations in the few weeks that you've been there. Do you want to share a little bit about those iterations, what that's been like?
Sure. Well, the first week that I was here was leading up to Zlatne Uste's Golden Festival, which is a big, this year it was online. Usually it's in person at a hall in Park Slope in Brooklyn. But it's a pretty enormous music and dance festival that's centered around like Balkan, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern music, mostly Balkan music, but different folk traditions. And so I always play that every year. And this year, you know, I submitted something for my band, a tune that I had recorded. My band's called Novi Hitovi Brass Band, which means new hits. And also I was playing in a couple different bands. I guess the first week I was here, I was kind of just chilling and like adjusting and settling in. Second week was really that push, like difficult, challenging work week. This week's been like balancing, resting, and just being present, and like starting to lean into some of the other projects that I've put on the back burner because I haven't been grounded enough to focus on them. So that's been cool. And creating and reading and cooking for myself, and like it's nice to be in an environment where I have no choice but to take care of myself. Which is also daunting because if I don't take care of myself, then I don't have food, or the stove isn't hot and it's cold. But it's actually been really good for me to have very tangible things to focus on, because it makes it harder to focus on the anxiety or the larger looming questions of this time, or even not of this time, that I would be wrestling with regardless. So
if you had to describe your music to someone, how would you describe it to them? Like, what would you share about it?
So I call my solo project Ani, that's Aani, and I classify it as electro brass pop. So I think people have a lot of different associations when you say pop music, but this is like independent, original, somewhat experimental pop music with horns, with electronic production, almost all of which like I write, produce, record, play every instrument on, do it all myself. That's not to say that there isn't room for collaboration. I'm also in a lot of collaborations these days, producing for people, or they're doing verses on my songs or whatever, but yeah, so for that project, you know, it's just you know, independent pop music with horns. I think the goal of it the intention is to kind of create sanctuary. That's like the goal of the music, is to build a space where like it's not just happy or sad, but there's actually room for people to feel and process the full range of human emotion. You know, I want to create music that's emotionally as complex and intimate as the human experience. So that's a big goal in it. And I also am reinterpreting a lot of traditions, some of which are ancestral lineages, some of which are musical lineages, and combining. So yeah, that's I would say it's a lot of poetry. It's becoming more kind of mystical as I kind of go deeper on a journey of mysticism. It's constantly evolving, and I would say I try to capture the energy of like the like dynamic energy and instrumentation of like a live band, because I'm a band leader and because I grew up in that context, into the like recorded realm. So I want something to be like both big and deeply intimate at the same time. So, and then Ashes I put out last September, 2020, and wrote before the pandemic, and then became like incredibly relevant in the pandemic. I was like, oh my God, I made a plague song, and then the plague hit, and I was actually going to drop it over the summer, and then it felt like really weird timing with like the uprising that was happening, and feeling like that it was taking on a new meaning that I didn't really want to be claiming as like my own. And so I kind of waited a little bit with it, and put it out. I had written it during the Jewish high holidays 2 years ago, and then put it out during the Jewish high holidays this past year. And so it felt very cyclical and circular to me. And that song is really, you know, I tend to think about music as offerings, as like an offering. I think that's the healthiest way that people can think about music, and also like the least commodified way we can think about music is like, instead of being like, hey everyone, hey, listen, like feeling like I'm shouting into a megaphone, listen to my song. It's like, here, I made this for me, I made this for something that's connecting all of us. If you want to listen, great, do with it what you will, you know. So I made that song. It's definitely like closer to hip hop, closer to a lot of different popular music from all over the world. Definitely drawing from salsa and from some Romani music, but also, and Jewish music, but also like just, I think, more straight ahead pop music than some of the other music I'd put out with, you know, like a form. Yeah, and that was a collaboration. I didn't make the instrumental on that, but that's the first single from an EP that I'm going to be putting out this year. So there's 3 other singles. Each one is like a different offering. Like that's the fire offering, and then I have like the one that's like earth or water or air. I don't say this explicitly, but that's how I think about it. It's 4 tracks. Each one is like a different elemental offering.
Nice.
And that's that EP. I haven't like officially announced it yet, but it's called Fresh Air / Neshama, and Neshama is like this kind of ancient Jewish understanding of spirit or soul, that there's like 3 different realms of soul, and Neshama is like the highest one, and it's the one that's like only gifted to human beings, and it's like through breath. And so I've been thinking a lot about breath in the context of COVID, and thinking, and as a horn player, and as someone who, breath is a very important mechanism and grounding tool for me. And so
you had talked about you know, some traveling that you had done in different cultures that had really influenced you. Is there anything in particular that sort of surfaces for you that you want to talk about that is very vibrant?
Well, I was able to travel twice to Serbia and Macedonia. Once with Zlatne Uste Balkan Brass Band, which is the band that I grew up watching and from the center of it, and then now I'm a member of. On this horn, the tenor horn, I play mid horn in that band. And that band started in the 80s. My dad was one of the founding members of it, and it's like Balkan traditions, mostly Serbian and Macedonian music, right? And a lot of it, not all of it. I mean, they play actually a pretty, as I've been able to see the music in the original context more, I've actually begun to recognize how broad their range is in terms of like the traditions that they have learned. I went for 2 weeks with Zlatne Uste, traveled, went to different competitions and festivals, played, studied with bands. It was amazing. That was like 2017. And then when I graduated Oberlin, I went with a group called YAMS, which is Young American Musicians to Macedonia and Serbia. It used to be called Chochek Nation. It's a group that, it was a youth ensemble from these Eastern European folk life centers, Balkan music and dance camps that they do every year. They do one upstate New York, and they do one in Mendocino in California. And I've been to both, but I grew up going to the one on the East Coast in High Rock, New York, or Monticello. Rock Hill is where it is. And yeah, we brought like a group of like 20 young American musicians who grew up in this scene, but it didn't really have, like myself before I went, an actual understanding of the original cultural context of a lot of these practices. And we studied with brass bands and different kinds of bands in Macedonia and Serbia. It was amazing. And I mean, I was one of the participants in it. I wasn't really one of the organizers. I was there with them. And I had gotten a separate grant from Oberlin to go. It paid for my flight, and then I stayed for 3 weeks afterwards by myself and studied with bands, traveled by myself, studied with like different mentors I had from going the first time, and also from the EEFC flying people over to work at their camps. So so I had an incredible 3 weeks by myself there. And then I think seeing music as like a really vital community practice. We tend to think about music as like or the arts in general as like a personal, like, oh, that's cute, you know, like, or like, oh yeah, like do it, like you'll make it big or whatever. It's like seeing it as like a real communal necessity, like that fulfilled a very important cultural function, was really important for me. And definitely I don't know, just informed my own practices a lot. So yeah. So that was cool. And like learned a lot about the music, able to bring a lot back with me. And I'm actually now trying to start up this project that's going to be a lot of American bands from the States that play music from the Balkans, and the proceeds from it are going to go to families of Roma musicians in the Balkans who have, because of COVID, lost almost all their work. You know, they play weddings all summer, and it's like hundreds of people, and they were actually, like, fortunately officially banned this past summer, which meant that people unfortunately have lost pretty much all their income. But we're trying to create some infrastructure where like we can kind of complete the cycle, and money can go back to the folks from whose music we've profited, you know, and not just in terms of money, but in terms of profit, meaning like we've built community around this. That's an amazing thing. It's a meaningful thing. I don't think it's a bad thing, but it's trying to complete the cycle a little bit. So that was meaningful for me. I also was able to travel to Cuba by myself for a week and a half when I was like 19, and study with musicians there who play like mostly Cuban jazz, and then also some traditional music, a little bit of hip hop. But I think if I went back now, I would be more focused on like independent music and like electronic stuff and self-produced music. But it was cool to kind of see the jazz inside the jazz world. I got to sit in with bands and play it, perform, and study, and it was amazing. And then yeah, I studied in Nicaragua when I was at Oberlin. I did like a semester in Nicaragua, kind of studying like youth culture and media and literacy, and ended up working at a recording studio on the Caribbean coast there as a producer, helping people just kind of like, I don't know, like polish their tracks a little bit and finish some stuff. And we never got to finish the project because there was an insurrection, and I ended up having to leave. And so I'm hopefully going to be able to go back there at some point. But that's some of the travel I've been really, really incredibly fortunate to be able to experience. And definitely all of that has shaped both my actual musical practices and then like my perspective and going back to my musical practices and kind of reevaluating, and also just like I just learned a lot. So yeah, there's all that. But you know, I consider this a part of that too, just in terms of like having time and learning and also being able to embrace parts of me that maybe I have overlooked because I brought a guitar here, and I'm remembering all the ways in which like folk music and different acoustic musics and stuff were really foundational for me, and remembering some of that and allowing myself to kind of access all of me. And yeah, you know, I think my whole thing is like we can make music out of anything. Like if I have my computer and my interface and a mic, we can make hits wherever, you know, like it doesn't matter. So it's but it's cool to be able to have this stationary and be able to just be intentional and not in that spontaneous energy as much, just in like a more of a reflective space.
Nice. I don't want to put you too far into the future because I know you're sussing things out and trying to be intentional, but do you have any inklings about next steps for you in terms of things that you want to be engaged with? I know you've mentioned a little bit throughout the course of the conversation, but is there anything else you want to share?
I mean, I'm moving back to the city for the spring and summer, and maybe going to be there afterwards, or I might potentially go to the Balkans. I want to continue to do meaningful community work while making music. I'm about to be releasing this music, and hopefully it'll I'll share it with everyone I know, and hopefully they'll share it with everyone they know. And it would be cool if that was, I mean, I feel blessed that I'm connected to a lot of different communities that create like geographically throughout the States, musically throughout New York, like that I feel like created an important web for me. I think my ideal is like, I don't know, it'd be cool to maybe work as a producer or a songwriter, and like as a kind of like a staff writer, maybe for a label or something. But I also really like the power of independent music, and I mean, it would be cool to just continue to create in collaboration, travel. I mean, come back here when I need to take a breath. But yeah, for me, like I never have like a lack of things to do. Like I always have like 4 or 5 songs that I'm creating. So it's just hard because it can be so self-driven. When I get back to the city, I think I'm going to be playing a lot on the street with some friends of mine. And I was doing that in October and November, and like really doing that, starting to do it as a job. And then I feeling bad about like the pandemic and about the weather and feeling like it wasn't worth it anymore. But I think that this summer, I think there's a way to do it that's safe and also like providing something people really need. Mm-hmm. You can't predict what's going to happen. You can just be a leaf, and the stream is going to keep going, and you can decide which part of it you want to go down, you know?